Tonight, you're not scrolling through some harmless little curiosity about old romance. You're sitting at the edge of a lamplit table, and the world is doing that quiet thing it does when it thinks nobody is watching. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch a thin sheet of lead get trimmed to palm size like a secret made practical. You'll learn the system Romans used to file desire names, knots, gods below, and the places where messages could be delivered. And you'll see how one tiny detail, a backward letter, a hair pressed into a fold, a nail through soft metal turns a private want into something that thinks it has authority. 3 small sensations: the chill of lead on skin, lamp oil warmth and smoke, a stylus scratching like a whisper that won't take no for an answer. Something nearby keeps time, a lamp flame nodding, steady and obedient, as if it has witnessed this kind of request before. And if your breathing starts to follow it, perfect. Inhale 4, exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, maybe that tiny scratch of the stylus will remember you there. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with roses or vows or the kind of love that behaves in public. It begins with a dull gray tablet cooling in a palm already halfway underground, already deciding it would rather be a command than a confession. You might not expect the most intimate arguments of the Roman world to be written on something as unromantic as a thin, dull sheet of lead, but that is often where they went. Lead chills the palm in a way that feels like it remembers underground places. A stylus makes a small, stubborn scratch. A lamp flame nods once, as if it has heard this before. In the Roman imagination, desire could be handled the way you handle paperwork. You don't wrestle it, you file it. You address it properly. You fold it, seal it, and send it to an office that is not entirely above ground. There were many kinds of magic in the Empire, but the love spells that survive tend to feel like administrative notes written to the underworld, as if Hecate were a clerk with a wax tablet and very steady handwriting. And the material is almost always slightly disappointing. Not gold, not a velvet ribbon, not even a nice piece of parchment. Just lead. The kind of lead you might also find lining pipes, holding roof tiles in place, or waiting in a workshop like a bored gray coin that forgot how to shine. A tablet begins as a thin sheet trimmed to a convenient size, often small enough to fit in a hand, the way a secret should. People scratch names into it as if names were handles. Sometimes the names are doubled or tripled, as though repetition could make a person easier to grip. Sometimes the letters are written backward in mirror script, because maybe the gods below read from the other side of things, or maybe it simply feels more serious when it's harder to read. You can picture the writer pausing, tongue slightly out, trying to form a backwards R with the concentration of a child learning to write, except this child is an adult Roman with a very specific emotional agenda and an alarming amount of patience. The names are not always famous names. That's part of what makes these tablets quietly charming. We see ordinary people trying to tug at ordinary lives. A woman with a name that will never be carved on a triumphal arch. A man who is not technically worth a statue. A rival whose greatest crime is existing in the same neighborhood. The tablet doesn't care. The tablet is democratic. It accepts anyone you can spell, and sometimes it accepts you even if you can't spell, because spelling in the ancient world had a flexible relationship with confidence. And then there are the little additions, the small props meant to give the spell a face, a strand of hair, a thread from clothing, a scrap that once touched skin. Not always, not in every case, but often enough that you can feel the human urge behind it. If I include a piece of you, then the message can't get lost. It's like adding a tracking number to a parcel, except the parcel is a feeling, and the delivery company is the underworld, and customer service is famously unavailable. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe, or don't. The Romans would understand that too. They loved commitment in theory, and in practice, they loved forgetting to RSVP. Once the lead has a name, it often gets a set of words that don't translate easily into modern calm. Some lines are perfectly ordinary Latin. Others are the linguistic equivalent of a drawer full of mismatched keys, nonsense syllables, strange names, long strings of vowels, words that feel like they were meant to be spoken more than understood. Scholars sometimes call them voces magicae, which is a polite way of saying, we're not sure what this means, but it is trying very hard. The rhythm matters, the sound matters. The sense can be optional, like the instructions on a piece of flat pack furniture you're going to ignore anyway because you're convinced you already know how it should go. The verbs, when they show up clearly, can be blunt in the way sleepy people are blunt. Bind, draw, burn, soften, return. Sometimes love appears, but not always in a poetic way. More often, it's a list of body parts, marched down the lines as if each one needs to be personally introduced to authority. Eyes, tongue, heart, belly, sleep. The spell doesn't just want affection. It wants control over the small daily motions that make a person themselves. It wants someone's feet to wander toward a door. It wants someone's mind to rehearse a name. It wants sleep to come badly, like a poorly made bed. It's a strange kind of tenderness, the kind that carries a clipboard. And the promised bargain is often small, almost domestic. The petitioner offers oil, a cake, a garland, a little something, not because miracles are cheap, but because the people asking are rarely wealthy enough to buy thunder. Even in magic, the Roman economy shows through. There's always a sense of budgeting, a sense that a god might accept modest payments as long as the paperwork is neat and the request is clear. It's not romantic, exactly. It is more like leaving a polite tip for the invisible forces that run the world while everyone else is asleep. When the writing is finished, the tablet becomes an object that wants to be carried somewhere. Love spells, especially the binding kind, don't just sit on a shelf. They travel. Sometimes they get rolled like a tiny scroll, because even lead wants to feel like literature. Sometimes they get folded, pressed flat, and pierced, because a spell, apparently, should be pinned down like a loose corner of fabric. The folding has a quiet satisfaction to it. It turns words into a compact shape, a little capsule of intention, like packing away a feeling so it stops wandering around the house. Some spells were accompanied by dolls, wax clay, sometimes more elaborate figures. A small human shape, simplified like the world seen from far away. The joints might be pierced with nails. The limbs might be tied. Knots appear in these contexts with a kind of bored consistency, because knots are the universal language of stay like this, 3 knots, 9 knots. Numbers that feel ancient because they are comfortable to count on tired fingers. Each knot is tightened with a whispered clause, as if the spell is being fastened into place one loop at a time. There's something almost craftsmanlike about it all. A Romain could go to the baths, argue about politics, buy fish, complain about the weather, and then go home and carefully knot a string around a small figure because their love life felt slightly out of alignment. It's less like cinematic witchcraft and more like fussy household maintenance, like adjusting a squeaky door, like tightening a loose sandal strap, like saying quietly, I would like the universe to behave in a slightly different way, and I have brought supplies. Sometimes a small mirror appears, placed face down, as if the target should not see any path except the one the spell points toward. Sometimes the packet is bound with lead wire, because if you're already using lead, you might as well commit to the theme. And then, very gently, the whole thing is made ready to be hidden. The most important ingredient at this stage is silence. Not dramatic silence, just the ordinary silence of someone walking through a city trying not to look suspicious while carrying an awkward secret that, if we're being honest, is a thin folded piece of metal with writing on it. Rome was full of such people. If you walk the streets long enough, you could probably trip over 3 quiet schemes before lunch. The place where the tablet goes matters because Rome was a city layered with meanings, like a cake made of stone and gossip. Many tablets went into graves, especially the graves of the untimely dead. People who died young were thought to have time on their hands in the underworld, which is a slightly grim way to imagine the afterlife. Less paradise, more spare capacity. If you needed an errand run, the restless dead were seen as efficient. There were also wells where water moved downward and secrets moved with it. There were baths, 2 places already filled with whispering, steam, naked honesty, and the kind of casual conversation that people later regret. Crossroads appear often because crossroads are where choices live, and magic loves to stand near choices like it's waiting for a bus. Some tablets were placed in shrines, in theaters, near stadium seats, anywhere crowds gathered and luck felt thin from being rubbed too often. In some cases, a coin is left as payment for the gatekeeper below, because even a message to the underworld benefits from postage. A nail might fix the tablet in place, not because the underworld is windy, but because humans like the reassurance of fastening things down. And then the petitioner walks away without changing pace. That detail, when you imagine it, feels very Roman. Control your face, keep your stride. Don't be the kind of person who looks like they just buried an emotional request in the ground. In a city where everyone was watching everyone else, secrecy was not a dark cloak. It was a normal expression. It was the everyday art of seeming ordinary while doing something quietly strange. Of course, the spell is not only about the human petitioner. It's also about who gets asked to help. The gods invoked in these tablets tend to be chthonic underworld-facing, earth-associated, comfortable with low places. Hecate shows up, often as a name with many edges. Persephone appears, queenly and distant, like someone who can approve a request without looking up. Pluto does putter sometimes because every realm has a manager. Daemons appear too, those restless in-between beings who are always available because they are never quite busy with official duties. Ancestors can be invoked as witnesses, which is a surprisingly legal-sounding role for the dead. Not accomplices, just witnesses. Rome loved witnesses. Rome loved the idea that reality improves when someone signs off on it. Local spirits appear as well nymphs of springs, genii of places, small divine presences with smaller workloads. If you can't get a major deity's attention, you try the local office. You try the spirit who actually lives near the well you're using. It's like trying customer support through a regional number instead of the main switchboard. The tone of many tablets is contractual. Do this and I will do that. I will give offerings. I will light a lamp. I will not let your altar go thirsty this month. The gods are treated like partners in an arrangement. Not always kindly, but consistently. Some tablets even sound impatient, as if the petitioner is annoyed that the universe requires forms. And occasionally you can hear something softer beneath it, something almost embarrassed. I want this. I don't know how to ask for it properly. So I'm asking the earth. But there is also the question of law and the thin line between acceptable ritual and punishable magic. Rome did not have one clean policy that said magic is forbidden and then put the matter to bed. Rome preferred a messier approach where magic becomes a problem when it becomes useful for accusing someone. There were laws against poisoning, against harmful charms, against practices that looked like they might destabilize the social order. And sometimes, if a scandal needed a hinge, magic was a very convenient hinge. A love tablet found in the wrong context could become evidence. Priests could become experts very quickly when expertise served the moment. Informers could blossom like weeds. And yet many people shrugged. People always shrug. Some cities fined the bold. Some ignored it until it was impossible to ignore. The empire was large, and consistency was not Rome's favorite hobby. The safest defense, if a tablet turned up with your handwriting on it, was modesty and a very tidy house. Not because tidiness repels legal trouble, but because it gives the impression you are too busy organizing your pantry to be organizing a supernatural binding. There were remedies too, because for every person who writes a spell, there is someone who worries a spell has been written about them. Counterspells appear in the sources like quiet undoing, knots untied, dolls washed, herbs burned, baths taken with extra seriousness, words spoken to convince breath to choose another road. Some of it is practical. If you believe something is binding you, you try to loosen it. Some of it is social. If you think your neighbor might be doing underworld paperwork about you, you may suddenly become very polite at the market. And then we arrive at the slow, slightly anticlimactic question: what does it look like when a love spell works? The tablets themselves rarely describe fireworks. They describe small changes. The target writes. The target wanders past a door. The target forgets an old plan. The target sleeps badly. The effects are measured in inches, not thunder. It is the kind of outcome that can always be called coincidence by friends, and called proof by the petitioner, and called a fulfilled contract by whichever god received the message and decided for reasons we will never know to nudge something gently. The payments, if they happen, are usually ordinary: oil, cakes, garlands, a small offering placed with the calm of someone paying a bill. This is not a world where miracles are expensive because they sparkle. Miracles are expensive because they require maintenance. And sometimes the most believable miracle is habit. The petitioner continues to do small offerings long after anyone remembers why. Because the ritual has become part of the week, like sweeping the floor or checking the latch. The spell remains below, working by habit, the way humans do. If you zoom out far enough, these tablets become less about supernatural certainty and more about the quiet human desire to speak into a world that doesn't answer. Weed is not a romantic medium, but it is durable. It stays. It survives fires, floods, time, and the general chaos of history. A love spell scratched on lid is a way of making a feeling heavy enough to last. The Romans had many ways of making things last: stone inscriptions, laws, family names, but for private wants, lead was enough. A thin gray sheet folded into a secret, placed where the earth could hold it. And now, very gently, we can gather the facts the way you gather a loose thread from a sleeve. Keep them in one jar: lid, names, mirror writing, knots, nails, graves, wells. Keep another jar for the softer things: want, fear, haste, the wish to be remembered by someone who is currently busy buying bread. Assume every command carries a price, even if the receipt arrives years late, even if it arrives in the form of nothing happening at all, which can also be a kind of price. Tomorrow, if you find yourself thinking about the old Roman habit of filing emotions with the underworld, change one small thing before you ask the earth to change someone else. Adjust your schedule by a minute. Untie a knot you don't need. Rewrite a sentence so it becomes kinder, or simply let a thought pass without fastening it down. The lamp dims. The stylus cools. The ground holds its breath the way it always does, patient and uninterested, and somewhere in the dark, a thin folded tablet rests like a quiet letter that never needed a reply. You might not expect one of the most important ingredients in Roman clothing care to be other people's urine, but Rome was a city that believed in practical solutions, and it also believed that if something works, you should not ask too many delicate questions about where it came from. Somewhere in the half-dark of a narrow street, a clay jar waits near a wall. A lamp makes a small orange puddle of light. A night breeze passes over stone. And softly, before we start talking about extremely tired togas and the quiet economics of smell, I'll ask in a whisper, where and what time are you listening from? In the Roman world, a toga was not just a garment, it was an announcement. It was a wearable statement that said, in fabric form, I am participating in public life. which is a big promise for something that can also trip you on stairs. Togas were heavy, awkward, and impressively good at collecting dust, sweat, wine splashes, and whatever else a busy city could gently throw at you. The idea of a toga being perfectly clean all the time is almost funny, in the way that imagining a modern white couch in a house with toddlers is funny. Rome, however, had professionals for this. Foolers, laundry workers, specialists in turning a tired, grayish cloth back into something that looked like it still belonged near a senator's shoulder. The process begins in a place that is not elegant. The Filonica, the fuller's workshop, was practical wet and busy in the way a place becomes when it is devoted to repeated scrubbing. Before any scrubbing happens, though, there must be something to scrub with. Water is not enough. Soap, in the modern sense, is not quite the Roman default. They had oils, they had ash, they had clever mixtures. And they had urine, which contains ammonia, which can help lift grease. Rome did not phrase it like that. Rome simply noticed that certain things made cloth come clean, and then built an industry around it. People could collect urine in household pots, but cities like Rome also had public collection points. Large jars set out in streets or near workshops, because the city was full of people producing small amounts of useful chemistry, day and night, without realizing they were contributing to laundry science. It's a strangely communal system, a shared supply chain, the kind of thing that makes you feel, briefly, that civilization is mostly logistics. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part where urine becomes taxable, feel free to subscribe, but honestly, don't strain yourself. Rome would prefer you conserve energy for the truly important tasks, like not spilling garum on your sleeves. Inside the Filonica, clothes arrive in bundles, folded or rolled or simply carried in a resigned heap. They are sorted the way any tired person sorts problems, by size, by importance, by how offended the owner might be if the stain remains. Some garments are everyday tunics. Some are expensive cloaks. Some are, unfortunately, togas that have attended too many speeches and too much heat. You can picture a worker lifting a toga and feeling its weight with a sigh that says, "This one has opinions." The fuller does not argue with the toga. The fuller negotiates with it using liquids and patience. A shallow basin waits, not quite a bathtub, not quite a sink, more like a stone or a plastered container designed for repeated stomping. And this is where the Roman laundry becomes quietly legendary, because the standard method involved feet. Workers stepped into the basins and stomped the cloth, rhythmically, like slow dancing with fabric that does not love you back. The motion is steady, the water sloshes, the mixture foams a little, and the cloth slowly gives up its stubborn oils and dirt, not dramatically, but gradually, as if it is being persuaded by repetition rather than force. The sound of the workshop would be gentle and endless, a soft slap of wet cloth. The low conversation of workers, the small clink of a bucket, the occasional annoyed remark when a corner of cloth flicks water where it shouldn't. This is not glamorous history. This is the history of someone's ankles being tired, the history of hands wringing fabric again and again. It is, in a way, perfect bedtime history, because nothing here rushes, nothing here explodes. It's all slow improvement, one stomp at a time, like a long day turning into a clean sleeve. And while the stomping happens, the city continues outside. Markets open, temples receive offerings. Someone argues about politics, someone buys bread, and somewhere a fuller continues stepping on fabric in a basin, calmly manufacturing the illusion that important people never sweat. That illusion is a service. Rome paid for services. Rome respected services. Rome also complained about them because Rome complained about everything. But the fuller's work mattered because status is delicate and it can be damaged by something as simple as a dingy hem. After the first cleaning, there is rinsing, lots of it, because whatever mixture was used Urine, ash, water, perhaps fuller's earth, must be removed. Cloth is lifted and plunged and squeezed. It drips. It becomes heavier for a while, like it has temporarily absorbed the entire concept of the river. Workers move it from basin to basin. Some workshops had a series of vats, a little like stages in a long, slow recipe. You can almost imagine a Roman describing this as if it were cooking. First you soak, then you stomp, then you rinse again because the gods love repetition and so do stains. There is also brushing. Fullers use tools that could raise the nap of the cloth or smooth it down again. Sometimes teasel spiky plant heads were used to comb fabric gently, pulling up fibers to make the surface softer or cleaner looking. It's a delicate step, oddly tender compared to the stomping. Like the cloth gets a careful grooming after its unpleasant bath. And then, because Roman fashion loved brightness, there is whitening. Sulfur fumes could be involved, especially for making garments look more brilliantly pale. You hang cloth in a small space, you let fumes do their quiet work, and you hope the result looks like fresh rather than haunted. This is the point where the Roman laundry begins to feel like it has a personality. It's not just cleaning, it's transforming, it's cosmetic. It's the ancient version of brightening filters. And the workers doing it are not mystical. They are tired professionals with practical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that comes from repeating a process until your body learns it better than your mind. If you ask them for a philosophical explanation, they might simply shrug and say, "It works." Rome loved that sentence. Now, because Rome could not leave a working system alone, it eventually did what all large systems do. It taxed it. Emperor Vespasian, famously practical, is associated with a tax on urine collected from public urinals and sold to fullers. The idea that an empire can look at a street jar and see revenue is one of those softly hilarious facts that makes you want to sit down and admire human consistency. We will monetize anything. We will tax anything. We will build an administration around anything, as long as it is predictable and slightly unpleasant. There's an old story about Vespasian defending the tax by holding up a coin and implying that money doesn't smell. Whether the scene happened exactly as told is less important than the fact that it sounds plausible. It sounds like Rome. It sounds like a man looking at a complaint and replying calmly, "Yes, and..." The fullers, meanwhile, likely continued doing what they did, because the laundry does not stop for moral debates. The laundry keeps moving, because cloth keeps getting dirty, because humans keep being human. Fullers were organized. They could form guilds. They could have social presence in neighborhoods. They could be recognized as essential workers in a very literal sense. Without them, public clothing becomes public embarrassment, and Rome was deeply afraid of embarrassment. Rome feared shame the way modern people fear seeing themselves in an unflattering photo. It's not deadly, but it is inconvenient. So the fuller sits inside this strange intersection of class and necessity. Wealthy people needed them. Ordinary people used them when they could. Everyone pretended not to think too hard about the smells. And yes, smells. A Phalonica likely smelled sharp, ammonia, wet wool, ash, the river, but stressed. Yet these workshops were part of the city's texture, like bakeries and metalworkers and fish sellers. Cities have a soundtrack and a scent track. Rome's scent track included laundry chemistry. It included the reality that cleanliness is not natural. It is manufactured. Every clean toga you see in a marble statue as imagination was paid for with someone's feet in a basin, someone's hand scrubbing, someone's patience, and a supply of liquids nobody writes love poems about. The people using these services might have had complicated feelings. On one hand, a clean toga makes you look like you have control over your life. On the other hand, handing your clothes to someone else means admitting you do not have time or perhaps the willingness to stomp them yourself. It's a small surrender. But Rome ran on surrenders like that. You outsource, You specialize. You keep moving, and then you complain about the prices. There's also the slightly awkward truth that many of the workers were enslaved or of lower status, doing physically demanding work so that higher status people could look effortlessly composed. Rome did not call it hypocrisy. Rome called it normal. And the Phalanca, like many workplaces, becomes a quiet place where the empire's social structure is visible in wet footprints. The people with clean togas are not the people doing the stomping. The people who benefit most from whitened cloth are not the people inhaling sulfur fumes. And yet, within the system, there is also skill and pride. A good fuller could handle delicate cloth. A good fuller could remove stains without ruining weave. A good fuller could deliver garments that looked almost new. That's a craft. It deserves the same sleepy respect we give to any craft. It requires repetition, attention, and a willingness to do something slightly boring until it becomes quietly impressive. If you've ever tried to fold a fitted sheet and felt your spirit leave your body for a moment, you already understand the emotional landscape of Roman laundry. When the garments are finished, they must be dried, and drying is its own gentle drama. Cloth hangs, water drips, air moves through courtyards. Sunlight does the slow work of evaporation like a patient hand smoothing wrinkles. In some places, garments might be pressed or stretched to keep shape. A toga wants to drape correctly. A tunic wants to sit properly. The final look matters because Rome watched surfaces. Rome reads surfaces like texts. A bright garment says, "I'm stable." A dingy garment says, "Something is slipping," even if what's slipping is simply your ability to avoid mud. Then the garment returns to its owner. A bundle is handed over. Coins change hands. Someone gives a quick inspection, not too obvious, because it is impolite to look desperate for cleanliness. The owner nods as if this is ordinary, which it is, and then walks back into the city wearing a fabric that has been negotiated back into respectability. It is, in a quiet way, a performance made possible by industry. The wearer gets the social benefits. The fuller gets the sore ankles. And sometimes, because humans are predictable, the wearer immediately spills something. Wine, oil, street dust. A little smear from leaning on a wall. The cycle begins again. This is why laundry businesses survive. Not because people are careless, though they are, but because life is messy and mess is loyal. It returns. It finds you. It sits on your sleeve with the confidence of an old friend. If you zoom out far enough, Roman laundry is not just about clean cloth. It's about the empire's obsession with appearance and its practical willingness to use unglamorous tools to achieve glamorous results. It's about chemistry discovered by accident and then turned into routine. It's about how cities create systems where even bodily waste becomes a resource, because resources are simply things you have decided to treat seriously. And it's about the quiet, repetitive comfort of small tasks. Stomp, rinse, wring, hang. The same actions day after day in a workshop that smells sharp and sounds steady. It's the kind of work that doesn't need an audience, and yet it supports an entire audience's idea of themselves, which is a very Roman arrangement. The empire loved invisible labor. It loved smooth surfaces. It loved the feeling that things were handled. So tonight, gently, without urgency, keep the facts in one jar. Basins, feet, lead jars on streets, ammonia, guilts, sulfur fumes, whitening, rinsing, brushing. Keep another jar for the softer things. Status, illusion, routine, the small pride of delivering something clean. Assume money can come from anything, even from a jar by a wall, because empires are creative in the most ordinary way. And if you ever feel tempted to believe that history is only battles and speeches, remember the Fuller's Workshop, where the great drama is a stubborn stain, and the great victory is a toga that looks, for one more day, like its owner has never sweated in public. The lamp dims, the water stills. The cloth hangs quietly in the air, becoming lighter by degrees. And somewhere in the sleeping city, a jar waits patiently, doing its uncelebrated part, while Rome continues softly, endlessly being practical. You might not expect a town's idea of public safety to involve a person sitting very patiently on a damp bench in leather breeches, waiting to see if the bench feels sticky. But medieval life had a special talent for turning ordinary liquids into official business. And beer, quiet, brown, everyday beer, was one of the most regulated comforts a sleepy street could offer. So let the room stay soft, let the air be still. Imagine a tiny candle wobbling in a draft. Imagine a wooden door settling into its frame with a small sigh. And very gently, in a whisper, where and what time are you listening from? In many medieval towns, ale was not a hobby. It was a necessity that happened to be drinkable. Water could be suspicious. Milk did not always cooperate. Ale, in its small, steady way, was the daily beverage of people who worked with their hands and needed something safe enough to sip without thinking. Which, of course, meant people did think about it, constantly. They thought about the price, the strength, the flavor, the foam, the honesty of the brewer, and the tiny tragedy of an ale that tastes like disappointment warmed in a barrel. And because towns hate disappointment, especially when it comes in a cup, they invented officials, ale tasters, ale conners, people whose job was to show up and confirm, in a calm, bureaucratic way, that the ale was not outrageously watered down, or secretly overpriced, or brewed with creative ingredients that belonged more in a hedge than a drink. It sounds dramatic, but it wasn't. It was paperwork with a heady aroma of yeast. It was law wearing a slightly damp apron. The inspection often began with something simple and tenderly unglamorous. A measure, a standard jug, a set volume. A town's idea of truth in liquid form. Brewers had to sell at an approved price, sometimes adjusted depending on the cost of grain. This meant the town had a relationship with barley that was almost personal. If barley prices rose, the town sighed. If barley prices fell, the town still sighed, but in a slightly different key. Somewhere in all of this, an official tried to keep a straight face while telling a grown adult that their livelihood depended on a properly filled cup. You can picture the scene without any urgency. A narrow street, a small alehouse with a low roof, a cask behind the counter, breathing quietly through its bung like a sleeping animal. The brewer, or more often, the alewife, because women brewed a great deal of household ale, stands there with a particular expression of someone who has heard the phrase, by order of the town, far too many times. The official arrives, not with a sword, not with a trumpet, with a container, a seal, and the calm determination of someone who plans to be mildly annoying until lunchtime. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. Medieval officials would not chase you down a street about it. They would simply write your name in a book, spell it 3 different ways, and call that closure. Taste came next, but taste was not the only tool. The town did not rely on a single sip and a thoughtful hum. It relied on routines because routines feel like control, and control is what people reach for when they cannot control the weather. Sometimes ale was checked for strength in the way people check anything when they don't have a lab, by experience, by reputation, and by the slow comparison of what good usually felt like. Stronger ale could be more expensive. Weaker ale could still be honest, as long as it didn't pretend to be something grand. Medieval life, in its own way, respected humble things provided they admitted they were humble. Then we reach the detail that history keeps like a small, ridiculous gem, the sticky test. In some places, ale conners wore leather breeches and sat on benches that had been splashed with ale. If the ale was too sugary or perhaps not properly fermented, or thick in a suspicious way, the bench might feel sticky and the leather might cling. It is not the kind of quality control you would expect to survive into legend, and yet here it is, lounging comfortably in our minds. Imagine making a living where the line between honest brewing and finable offense is whether your pants politely detach from a bench. It's important to say softly that the sticky britches story is often repeated and sometimes debated, like many charming historical details that are too perfect. But even when the exact method shifts from town to town, and the telling the spirit remains wonderfully true. People were trying to standardize an everyday drink using whatever tools they had, including their bodies, their patience, and their willingness to be mildly uncomfortable for the sake of civic order. A medieval town's greatest technology was, very often, a person who showed up. Once the ale had been observed, measured, tasted, and possibly sat upon, the official moved on to the next layer, the quiet magic of enforcement. This is where the most boring part of the bizarre story lives, and that's good, because boring is soothing. Fines were issued, names were recorded. The brewer might be told to adjust the price, or to stop selling until certain conditions were met, or to accept that the town had opinions about their phone. The official did not need to be cruel. The official only needed to be consistent. Consistency is the true medieval spell. And you can imagine the paperwork, ink that scratches, a ledger page with smudges from damp fingers, a list of offenses that reads like a sleepy poem, sold ale too dear, sold ale too weak, measured short, refused inspection, quarreled. There's something almost comforting about it. People complained. Officials wrote it down. Life continued. The town did not collapse because someone overcharged for a mug. It simply produced another note in a book and carried on, as if boredom itself were a form of stability. The brewer, meanwhile, went back to work. Brewing was not glamorous labor. It was waiting and stirring and lifting heavy wet grain and tolerating the moods of yeast. Yeast is a tiny creature with an enormous sense of autonomy. It does what it does. It does it when it wants. And the brewer tries to look authoritative while negotiating with invisible life. Imagine a woman leaning over a vat, smelling the surface, deciding if the batch is healthy or sulking. Imagine her making small adjustments, not unlike someone adjusting a blanket on a bed. A little more warmth, a little more time, a little less disturbance. And behind the scenes, towns also regulated the containers, because containers are where dishonesty can hide. A mug that looks large but holds less. A jug that pours like it's generous but isn't. Medieval officials loved standard measures the way a sleepy person loves a predictable routine. They might stamp a container, mark it, approve it. It's strangely modern, really. The same human need. Please don't trick me with math when I'm tired and thirsty. As the day drifted on, inspections became part of the town's rhythm. Not every day was a crackdown. Not every brewer was hauled into public shame. Usually it was quiet, a visit, a note, a reminder, a small civic nudge. The alehouse remained a place of murmurs and elbows on tables and slow conversations that went nowhere. If anything, the inspections helped preserve that atmosphere, because the true horror in a medieval alehouse would not be a ghost. It would be a watered pint served at a proud price. That kind of haunting stays with you. There were also social tensions wrapped around all of this. Alehouses were gathering places. They were also places where rumors grew legs. So regulation wasn't only about liquid, it was about keeping the town's social temperature steady. Too much drinking could be seen as disorder. Too little drinking could be seen as bleak. The town wanted the perfect middle. Enough ale to soften life, not enough to turn the street into a chorus. That's an impossible balance, but towns love impossible balances. It gives them something to manage. Sometimes the officials' work brushed up against morality in the way medieval life often did. There were rules about when you could sell, where you could sell, whether you could sell on holy days, how late the door could stay open, whether certain people should be there at all. It's easy, from far away, to see it as control. It's also easy to see it as anxiety dressed up as law. People wanted the town to feel safe. They also wanted to relax. So they made rules, then bent them softly, then made more rules. That pattern is older than stone. And still, through all of it, the ale itself remains charmingly plain. It isn't usually the strong, modern beer you imagine. Much everyday ale was mild. A small comfort, something that could be drunk through the day without flattening you. It was, in a way, the medieval version of a little something warm, the kind of drink that pairs well with exhaustion and bread, the kind of drink that doesn't ask you to be impressed. It only asks you to be less thirsty. Now and then, an inspection would lead to a small public moment, nothing dramatic. Just the town doing that thing it does, where it becomes one big shared opinion. A fine might be announced, a brewer might be warned. Someone might mutter that the official is biased, or that the brewer is unlucky, or that nobody appreciates honest labor anymore. All of these sentences could be spoken in 1320 and also yesterday. The setting changes. The human tone stays the same. If a brewer repeatedly offended the rules, consequences could stack up in that slow, bureaucratic way that feels both gentle and relentless. Not prison, necessarily. More like a steady tightening of options, fines, temporary bans. A reputation that follows you like smoke. And reputation mattered, because people came back to the same places, drank the same drinks, trusted the same hands. A medieval town was a small network of memory. Everyone remembered everything except spelling. And after a while, you begin to see the deeper calm beneath the silliness. The sticky bench story is funny, yes, but it also hints at how deeply people cared about fairness in small things. Not fairness as a philosophical banner, but fairness as, please don't sell me air and call it ale. Please don't charge me like I'm rich when I'm not. Please don't thin it down so much that I can taste your impatience. These are quiet requests. These are bedtime level concerns. They are also the foundation of daily life. So the official goes home at the end of the day. He takes off his cloak. He removes his hat. If he wore leather breeches and sat on benches, perhaps he does a private inspection of his own dignity and decides not to mention it at dinner. He eats something plain. He sleeps. The brewer sleeps too, because brewing begins again tomorrow, and yeast does not accept excuses. The town sleeps, with its rules tucked around it like an old blanket full of patches. And in the morning, the barrels wait. The measures wait. The ledger waits. The alehouse door opens again with a familiar creak. Someone pours a drink. Someone complains. Someone laughs softly and then forgets why. The town remains. The regulations remain. The mild tyranny of standards continues, not to crush joy, but to keep joy from becoming suspiciously expensive. Keep the facts in one jar. Measures, fines, sealed jugs, leather, benches, yeast, grain prices, officials with ink-stained fingers. Keep the softer things in another, the desire for routine, the comfort of a familiar mug, the strangely human hope that the world can be made fair through small, repeated checks. And if tomorrow feels too loud, remember that somewhere in history, an entire community once tried to protect itself from disappointment using nothing but a cup, a rule, and the quiet, determined stickiness of civic life. The candle lowers. The room settles. The street becomes only a faint idea. And the ale, mild and ordinary, continues to exist without needing a dramatic ending. You might not expect the success of a supernatural contract to be measured in such quiet units. Not thunder. Not visions. Just the small, ordinary changes a person can plausibly deny the next morning. A stranger pauses half a second longer near your doorway. A message arrives with fewer words than usual, as if the writer fell asleep mid-sentence. Someone happens to pass your street again, which is the ancient version of refreshing a feed and pretending it's fate. And somewhere beneath all that softness, under soil that smells like cool iron and old rain, a thin sheet of lead waits patiently, holding a name like a folded note that will never be unfolded in public. In the Roman imagination, the buried tablet didn't need to explode with drama. It only needed to persist. It was not a fireworks display. It was a slow drip like water in a cistern. A person who asked the underworld for help did not always expect a sudden cinematic outcome. They expected something less impressive and more believable. They expected the target to grow distracted, to grow restless, to lose their appetite at the wrong hour, or to remember someone they shouldn't be thinking about in the way people remember a song they don't even like. It's very practical in a strangely unromantic way. If your magic can't survive the scrutiny of daylight, you keep it in the shade and let it do its work like dust settling. The petitioner, the one who wrote, folded, and surrendered the tablet, also had to behave like someone who believed in a contract. That's a calm kind of belief. You don't run around shouting, "It's working." You wait, you watch, you interpret. You become, very gently, the world's sleepless detective. The evidence is never a smoking torch. It's a small shift in routine. A delayed greeting. A second glance. The target laughs at a joke that isn't funny. The target looks tired in a way that feels satisfying because tiredness is a tiny surrender. And the petitioner thinks, quietly, yes. The message is reaching them. Somewhere below, the mail is being sorted. Sometimes the proof arrived in a form that was almost disappointingly normal. The target writes. The target wanders past. The target forgets old plans, or at least says they forgot, which is a useful thing to say when you want to change direction without admitting you re-changing direction. Friends call it coincidence because friends are always invited to be sensible. The petitioner calls it confirmation because the petitioner has invested effort, secrecy, and a small amount of lead. The gods, if they are consulted at all, are imagined as nodding like accountants. Yes, the clause is being processed. Please allow time for delivery. If you are still awake by the time we reach the part where miracle is paid in cakes and lamp oil, feel free to subscribe. But honestly, don't strain yourself. Even ancient spirits, supposedly tireless, had a reputation for being slow when the paperwork was unclear. It's easy to forget that ancient requests, especially love requests, often came with the same anxious logic you see in modern habits. People wanted reassurance. They wanted a system. They wanted a lever they could pull when another person's feelings felt like weather. And since weather is rude and doesn't listen, they turn to ritual. A tablet is a way of turning longing into a document. A document is comforting because it has edges, even if those edges are made of lead and buried in a graveyard. And then there's the question no one can avoid, even in a sleepy monologue. What happens when nothing happens? Because sometimes the target does not write. The target does not wander past your door. The target sleeps just fine, thank you, and continues living like a person who was never pinned to a sentence on a folded sheet. In those cases, the petitioner could still interpret. Perhaps the DA is busy. Perhaps the messenger daimon took a wrong turn. Perhaps the underworld is overwhelmed, like a post office after a holiday. Perhaps the petitioner made an error, misspelled the name, chose the wrong epithet, offered the wrong bargain, or failed to hide the tablet in a place with enough authority to carry the message downward. Authority mattered in these practices, at least in the logic of the people doing them. A tablet tucked under a threshold had a certain domestic intimacy. A tablet sunk into a well had that cool, deep seriousness. A tablet buried with an untimely dead person had urgency, like giving your complaint to someone already headed in the right direction. Not because anyone was trying to be dramatic, necessarily. Sometimes it was just convenience. Graves were dug. Wells existed. Crossroads were already there, waiting like a natural filing cabinet for anxious humans. And even when a spell worked, the workings could look like a gentle unraveling rather than a conquest. The target becomes moody. The target grows uncertain. The target finds themselves at the bathhouse and cannot quite enjoy the steam because their mind keeps walking somewhere else. The target starts a conversation and then forgets the point halfway through, which is both tragic and extremely common. The target's dreams grow crowded, not with monsters, just with small repeats, a name, a face, a doorway, a street they don't need to walk down, and yet, somehow, it appears. For the petitioner, that kind of change was perfect. It left no fingerprints. It didn't demand witnesses. It didn't create a public scandal that would attract the attention of priests, magistrates, or the sort of neighbor who treats other people's misfortune like entertainment. It was private, it was plausible, and it was, in the end, what most people want, a shift that can be mistaken for choice. The payment side of the contract, when imagined, was also quietly mundane. Ancient magic often talks like it understands the price of bread. Offerings might be oil cakes, garlands, things that smell nice, burn slowly, or can be placed on an altar without anyone asking too many questions. Miracles are expensive, yes, but not always in gold. Sometimes in repetition. Sometimes in carefulness. Sometimes in the petitioner's willingness to keep their mouth shut and their routine steady. It is less like buying a miracle and more like maintaining a subscription that no one else can see. The monthly plan includes patience and silence. There is also the tenderly dull fact that people could keep using the habit even after they forgot the reason. A person might bury a tablet and move on, then later bury another for something else. Not because they were constantly desperate, but because ritual becomes a way of handling life. You get a headache, you drink something bitter. You feel powerless, you write something sharp into lead. You feel uncertain, you tie a knot, or you ask a god. Or you leave a small offering, because doing something feels better than doing nothing. The underworld becomes, in practice, a quiet suggestion. If you can't control the situation, at least you can file a complaint. And in the city itself, life continues above the buried lines. Lamps are lit, shops close. A seller counts coins that smell like hands. Someone sweeps a threshold. A dog sleeps in a doorway like it owns the law. People pass without knowing they're walking over someone's folded wish. That's the strange comfort of it. The magic is not loud. It doesn't interrupt commerce. It doesn't demand an announcement. It simply rests beneath the world like a thought you can't shake, but quieter. Of course, not everyone approved. There were always people who called it illegal, shameful, ridiculous, or impious. Some saw it as a crime, especially if it involved harm or coercion, or if it became useful as evidence during a convenient scandal. The line between private ritual and public trouble could be thin, like the lead itself. A tablet discovered in the wrong context could turn into a moral speech. And moral speeches, as you know, are the one thing in history that never runs out of breath. So people were careful. They hid the work. They used coded language. They wrote in awkward phrasing or reverse letters, or mixed names with titles and epithets, so the target could be identified without being plainly stated. They used the safe pronouns, the safe ellipses. That gentle fear of being seen shaped the practice as much as belief did. Even in a world full of gods, people still worried most about neighbors. And then, the most sleep-friendly part of all, what remains. Because centuries later, we often don't get the dramatic outcome. We get the object. We get the lead, folded and pierced, sometimes with nail holes, sometimes rolled like a tiny scroll that never wanted to be read in the first place. We get the scratched letters, the cramped lines, the odd mix of formal legal tone and personal panic. We get the repeated verbs, bind, burn, draw, soften, return like someone trying to control the universe with a small set of commands. It's both haunting and hilariously limited, like trying to fix your life with only 5 buttons. Sometimes the tablet includes lists of body parts, as if desire can be organized by anatomy. Eyes, tongue, belly, sleep. Sleep is a particularly revealing one. People didn't just want the target to think of them. They wanted the target's rest to be disrupted, not with terror, but with restless focus. The ancient mind understood what modern minds also understand. If you can't sleep, you can't feel stable. And if you're not stable, You might make choices you wouldn't make when well rested and rational. It's an unsettling logic, but it's also bluntly human. People aim their magic at the softest hinge. What's almost funny in a dry way is how much of this resembles ordinary persuasion, just dressed up in underworld clothing. The petitioner wants attention. The petitioner wants proximity. The petitioner wants the target to happen to show up. The petitioner wants a reply. The tablet is like sending a message and then placing your phone face down, pretending you're calm while still hearing every phantom vibration. Ancient technology, same nervous system. And so, if we imagine the end of the process is in a grand finale, it's an ongoing habit of interpretation. The petitioner notices a small sign and stores it carefully, like a coin in a jar. The target acts in a slightly different way, and the petitioner treats that difference like proof. The community never sees the whole story. The gods never issue receipts. The underworld never sends a confirmation email. The only confirmation is the petitioner's sense of pattern, stitched together from moments that could be anything. Keep the facts in one jar: laid tablets, folded seams, nail holes, wells, graves, crossroads. Names written backward, quiet offerings of oil and cakes, the legal tone that makes desire sound like a contract. Keep the softer fog and another coincidence, longing, patience, the way people want the world to respond when they whisper to it. Assume every command risks a price, even if the price arrives years late in a form no one can point to. Change one small thing tomorrow, your schedule, your sentence, your patience, before you ask the earth to change someone else. The lamp dims. The stylus cools. The ground holds its breath the way it always does, and the buried words remain where they were placed, working or not working with the same quiet, stubborn calm as everything else that waits in the dark. You might not think someone's entire job could be listening to the night, but that is more or less what a medieval monastic timekeeper did. While the rest of the community tried its best to pretend that sleep was a respectable form of prayer, one monk stayed half awake beside a dripping candle or a sighing water clock, paying attention to minutes that no one had yet bothered to invent. Time itself was still slightly softer on the edges. Nights lengthened, shrank, slid around the calendar. Yet the bell always had to ring on schedule, and schedule here meant whenever we have all agreed that God expects us to be up. Not dramatic, just profoundly inconvenient. The job seems simple at first glance. Wake up the community at the correct moments, usually many, many times before dawn. But in a world without alarm clocks, wristwatches, or glowing numbers staring at you from the bedside table, correct is a polite fantasy. The timekeeper learned to accept approximation as an art form. If you are still awake by the time we get to wax trippings and soggy wick measurements, you are welcome to subscribe or to mentally ring a little bell of approval. But please don't make a special effort. Medieval horologers certainly didn't. For a monk in charge of the hours, the night began before it began. In a typical monastery, the canonical hours sliced the dark like slow, uneven pieces of cake. First came Compline, the last office before bed, where everyone murmured psalms about trusting in the Lord, while sneaking glances at how comfortable their straw mattress was going to be. Then the great silence settled in. During that silence, somewhere in a chamber attached to the church, a water jar was being filled or a candle carefully trimmed and lit, because the next official interruption of sleep vigils or matins, depending on the house, would arrive when the device said so. That device was, to put it politely, moody. Water clocks had a kind of personality. A simple version might be just a pot with a tiny hole drilled in the bottom, set inside another vessel to catch the slow leak. More elaborate ones had floats or marked rods that rose or fell, telling the timekeeper how the night was draining away. The problem, as anyone who has ever boiled pasta knows, is that water has opinions about temperature. Cold nights slowed the flow. Warm nights made time hurry. Algae, dust, and the occasional insect contributed their own scheduling suggestions. The result was a system only as precise as a dripping tap. Yet for centuries, this was considered good enough to decide when an entire community should get out of bed. Candles on paper were simpler. Certain monasteries calculated time by how fast a candle of known size burned. You pour the wax, you measure the length, you scratch tiny notches at equal intervals. Each notch is a unit of time, maybe 15 minutes, maybe half an hour, depending on local optimism. The timekeeper lights the candle, places it in a sheltered niche, and checks every so often how far the flame has eaten. It sounds straightforward until you remember that candles, like water, live to disappoint engineers. Drafts, impurities in the wax, humidity, and the monk's own impatience could all widen or shrink the hours. A candle near a doorway might consume 1 hour, with heroic speed, and then loaf lazily through the next 2. What makes all this quietly entertaining is that there were names for these imperfect slices. Matins might slide around by almost an hour over the year, but it retained its title with pure confidence. Lauds crowed closer to dawn. Prime followed at what we would approximate as 6 in the morning, except when it wasn't. Time wasn't a line. It was a cluster of obligations orbiting sunrise and sunset. The community didn't ask, is it 3:15? But is it about time for the second nocturne? The answer often depended on whether the timekeeper had nodded off. The timekeeper rarely worked with just one signal. A cautious monastery set multiple checks in motion, a water clock in one room, a marked candle in another, and the faint hint of dawn creeping into the eastern windows as a final referee. On cloudy mornings, the person in charge of waking everyone might shuffle outside, squint at the sky, feel the air, and literally listen to the birds. Certain birds began complaining at roughly the same stage of the night. If the candle was short but the birds were quiet, perhaps the candle had burned too fast. If the pot was not yet empty but a pale line lurked behind the hills, perhaps a spider had sabotaged the whole. Medieval timekeeping was, in effect, a negotiation between tools, weather, and wildlife. Sometimes the tools were given their own attendants. The sacristan, who cared for the church itself, might also tend the clocks, trimming candle wicks so they burned cleaner, or scraping lime deposits from the water vessels. In some communities, a designated horologer emerged, a monk, who specialized in keeping and repairing the time devices. This was not considered glamorous. No illuminations show a shining saint holding a water pot with a tiny hole, unless the artist was feeling extremely mischievous. Yet the role balanced a surprisingly large amount of power with an absolutely minimal amount of prestige. If the horologer misjudged, everyone suffered. If he did well, no one noticed. We know from scattered complaints in monastic rules and letters that the nights did not always run smoothly. A chronicle might grumble, very politely, that brother so-and-so was not attentive to the bell. Translation: the community woke either too early or too late for comfort. Too early meant stumbling into the dark, chanting psalms between half-swallowed yawns, and feeling cheated out of something precious. Too late meant a panicked rush, skipped prayers, and the nagging sense that heaven kept a very accurate attendance sheet. For a timekeeper already half exhausted, either outcome probably felt like proof that time hated him. Imagine, for a moment, the simplest failure. The candle is lit. The timekeeper settles on a stool nearby, intending to keep vigil. The chamber is warm, stone-lined, and very quiet. The flame wavers in a way that strongly suggests continued existence. The monk folds his hands. He says a song. The monotony of the words blends with the faint rush of water some distance away, and his eyelids do what eyelids have always done when faced with monotony. When he startles awake, the candle has eaten through 2 notches instead of 1. The scheduled office is already in session in heaven, at least. Now he must decide whether to ring the bell late or pretend the device malfunctioned, or most temptingly convince himself that the missing interval has somehow been prayed through on credit because of such human moments. Rules were occasionally written to remind timekeepers to wake other monks if they were feeling drowsy. In some houses, the timekeeper did not wait alone. Another brother might share the watch, not only to keep company, but to serve as mutual insurance. If one nodded off, the other can nudge him back into awareness with the kind of firm charity that leaves bruises. This turned keeping time into a shared exercise in obedience and endurance, but also, in a way, into a makeshift sleepover. Two men in wool habits, sitting in a stone room, focusing on a slowly shrinking candle. It is hard to imagine a calmer, duller, more reliable method of enforcing humility. Once the decision was made, whether by candle, water, or a bird, the next stage began, waking the house. In many monasteries, the timekeeper walked through the sleeping quarters with a small lantern, gently calling out a phrase or touching shoulders, like the world's earliest, softest notification system. In some customs, he sang a short verse at each doorway. In others, he simply whispered the opening words of the coming psalm and waited for consciousness to collide with duty inside each bed. The modern equivalent might be a ringtone that is technically optional but culturally irresistible. The bell itself made the public announcement. Bells had personalities too, recorded lovingly in chronicles. One was large and slow, another sharp and eager, a third stubborn about tuning. The timekeeper or sacristan pulled the rope, feeling the weight of sound climb the tower, turn, and fall. In a town or countryside where few people owned timepieces, that sound was more than a religious call. It told surrounding villagers when to start work, when to head to market, when to close the day. The inner confusion of water jars and candle stubs translated into a shared rhythm for fields and shops. In this way, the sleepiness of one monk could, in theory, make an entire valley early or late. Outside the cloister, lay people develop their own relationship to these carefully mismeasured hours. A farmer might say, "I'll meet you at the bell after prime," or "we'll be finished by vespers." They didn't need precision, only predictability. If the bell was always slightly wrong in the same way, it became reliable in its wrongness. It is not so different from a clock that runs 3 minutes fast, as long as you remember to adjust in your head. The real difference is that today's off-by-3-minute device does not depend on whether someone fell asleep in a stone chamber at 2 in the morning. Over time, mechanical clocks crept into towers, with gears and escapements, and eventually, faces that glared information in all directions at once. These clocks still wandered, still needed winding, still sulked in extreme weather, but they were steadier than dripping jars. Some monasteries embraced them. Others blinked suspiciously before admitting that a machine which knocked a hammer at regular intervals was, in fact, extremely convenient. The job of the timekeeper shifted from watching a candle to listening for the mechanism's complaint, oiling it, and occasionally climbing up to reset the hands when they decided to be creative. Yet even with technology, the human element refused to retire. Someone had to remember to wind the clock. Someone had to decide when to adjust for changing sunrise, or whether the community would continue pretending that 6 was 6 even when dawn disagreed. The rhythm of prayer remained loosely attached to nature, even as iron gears tried to impose their own stubborn beat. Underneath the ticking and clanging, the old habits persisted, glancing at the sky, noticing the birds, feeling in one's bones whether the night was old or young. If you compare all this to modern life, the parallel is quietly funny. We carry phones that can tell us the time to the second, synchronized across continents by invisible signals. Yet people still ask, is it about lunchtime? Or does this feel like morning or afternoon to you? We still respond not only to numbers, but to light, hunger, mood, and social context. A medieval timekeeper would recognize this instantly. He would simply be puzzled by why we check glowing rectangles every few minutes instead of a single shared bell. For the monks, the reward for this delicate work of measuring was not praise. The best outcome was normalcy. No one thanked the timekeeper when the night offices felt perfectly placed between too early and too late. That sweet spot simply vanished into the day, taken for granted. Only when things went wrong did his existence become painfully obvious. It is a career path similar to running an invisible support service, or perhaps moderating a comment section before comment sections existed. If no one complains, you are doing it right. But no one notices that they are not complaining. What remains of these efforts, centuries later, is usually not the devices themselves, which rusted, cracked, or melted, but the rules and occasional grumbles about them. Monastic statutes explain how long each office should last, according to the season, which is a charmingly imprecise phrase when you realize summers in Norway and Italy behave quite differently. Chronicles mention building or repairing a clock as a notable expense. In one place, a note records that the bell for matins was henceforth to be rung more carefully, suggesting that less carefully had been an issue. These fragments do not crash into our imagination like battles or coronations. They just murmur in the archives like the low background noise of practical life. If you imagine yourself now as that timekeeper, sitting with a candle and a pot, and a half-listen to chant in your memory, you might notice how similar it is to lying awake. Checking the time on your phone when you can't sleep. You tell yourself you won't look again for at least an hour. 10 minutes later, you look again. The medieval equivalent was glancing at the wax and deciding it must have burned faster than it actually had. People have always negotiated with time as if it were a slightly unreasonable friend. So we can end, though not quite end, with a quiet little rule, borrowed from those long ago nights. Keep the facts in one jar, a candle that shortens, a water clock that leaks, a sky that lightens, bells that ring a bit earlier in summer and a bit later in winter. Keep the feelings in another, the reluctance to get up, the comfort of routine, the faint pride of being the one who knows when the silence will break. Assume every schedule is approximate and every hour is a suggestion, even if the timetable pretends otherwise. Change one small thing tomorrow, a wake-up alarm, a reminder, the moment you check the sky, before you ask the universe to be more precise on your behalf. Somewhere in an old stone tower or in the back of your own mind, a bell waits to be rung at about the right time. And that is usually close enough for both prayer and sleep. You might not expect an ancient Roman love story to begin with something as unromantic as a thin sheet of lead, but Rome often preferred objects that could survive damp soil, bad luck, and long silences. Lead has that patient heaviness. It sits in the palm like a cooled down coin, and it makes the person feel, briefly, as if their feelings have become measurable. Not noble, not poetic, just wakeable. And for someone who feels too much or feels too stuck, that alone might have felt like progress. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let your eyes rest. Let your shoulders drop as if they've finally received permission. Somewhere in another century, a small oil lamp would have done the same, dipping its flame towards sleep while someone leaned over a tabletop and decided to file their desire like paperwork. And if you're still awake long enough to hear a few unnecessary details, you can subscribe if you want. Or don't. The underworld never really cared about engagement metrics, and it would be odd to start now. In the beginning, it's not magic in the dramatic sense. It's preparation. A person chooses lead because papyrus tears and wax smears and feelings. Well, feelings do both, constantly. Lead stays. It can be trimmed to a neat rectangle, palm-sized, easy to hide, easy to fold, easy to pretend it's nothing important if someone walks in. A stylus scratches across it with a dry little sound, like a quiet insect tapping messages into metal. You can imagine the writer pausing between strokes, listening for footsteps, then continuing anyway, because privacy has always been a luxury and romance has always been impatient. Names appear early, because names are handles. In a crowded city, a name is how you grip one person out of thousands. Sometimes the name is written more than once, as if repetition can keep it from slipping away. Sometimes it's written strangely backward, doubled or looped, because the point is not readability. The point is capture. And alongside the name, the writer might add small things that feel almost tender in their bluntness. A thread pulled from clothing, a bit of wool, a scrap that once brushed skin. Not to be sweet, but to be specific. The ancient world loves specificity. It's hard for a spell to get lost when it's carrying an address label. Even then, the language can feel oddly plain. It doesn't always sound like a poem. It sounds like a list of verbs that have been told to behave. Bind, draw, burn, soften, return. If you've ever tried to talk yourself into being calm, you know, the tone-short words, firm words, words that pretend they can command a nervous system. Some tablets even march through the body in a strangely bureaucratic way, naming eyes, tongue, belly, sleep, as if each part needs to be put under custody like a misbehaving citizen. It's controlling, yes, but it's also oddly human. The belief that if you can name the problem precisely enough, you can finally stop feeling helpless, and then come the words that do not translate and do not seem to want to. Those little strings of syllables voces magicae sit on the page like pebbles in a line, meant to sound important rather than mean anything obvious. They can be borrowed from other languages, invented entirely, or just shaped to feel heavy in the mouth. The writer might whisper them while they carve, testing the rhythm like someone rehearsing a password. The absurd part is that the syllables are sometimes the most confident thing in the whole process. The person writing may be anxious, lonely, irritated, embarrassed, and still those syllables sit there like they own the world. Sometimes the tablet includes a bargain, because Rome could turn almost anything into a contract, including devotion. Offerings promise later oil, cakes, garlands if the god moves the heart today. It has the same sleepy logic as promising yourself a reward after finishing a task. Only the task is convincing the universe to nudge a particular person in your direction. The writer is basically saying, very softly, if you do this for me, I will be annoying in a new way, but with incense. Once the lead is filled with names and commands and untranslatable syllables, it stops being a note and starts being a parcel. It has to go somewhere. It cannot remain on a table like a diary entry. It must be carried to places that feel like borders, between light and dark, between public and private, between the living and whatever listens underneath. Some people added small figures, wax or clay, because a figure gives the spell a body to talk to. The little doll might be pierced at the joints, not in a cinematic way, but in a symbolic, practical way. If the knees are pinned, the target can't walk away. If the arms are bound, the target can't reach elsewhere. Symbolism does a lot of work when you don't have a customer service line for the gods. Asterisk knots appear. 2, with the stubbornness of an old habit. 3 knots, 7, 9, numbers that feel ancient even when you don't know why. Each knot tightened with a whispered clause, like adding signatures to a contract nobody will ever officially recognize. Occasionally, a small mirror is involved, turned face down, because apparently even reflection can be a security risk. There's something quietly funny about that hiding a plan from someone by making sure a mirror can't see it like the spell is worried it might be recognized by its own face, and then the tablet goes to sleep in a place chosen for its downwardness. Graves are common, especially graves of the untimely dead, because the restless were thought to be good at errands. Wells work too, because they're deep and always listening, and they carry sound in that peculiar way water does. Crossroads shrines appear, places where choices happen and where small offerings look normal. Theater stones and stadium seats show up as well, which suggests that some people delivered their deepest anxieties to the same places they went for entertainment, because humans have always been like that, mixing desperation and routine as if it's a perfectly reasonable recipe. A coin might be added because even spirits appreciate a tip, and because Rome loved the idea of a gatekeeper. A nail might be driven through the folded lead, fixing the message so it cannot wander, like pinning a thought in place. Then the petitioner presses the earth flat again, patting it with the calm seriousness of someone smoothing a bedspread. No dramatic exit, no thunder, just a person walking away at a normal pace, trying not to look like they've just buried an emotional instruction manual in public space. Once the tablet is down there, it needs the right audience. Not the bright gods of open-air temples and cheerful festivals. The chthonic ones. Hecate at the crossroads. Persephone, who understands the logic of being taken and returned. Pluto, who receives requests the way a stone receives rain, without enthusiasm, but with inevitability. Some tablets speak to daemons too, those in-between spirits who are not quite gods and not quite human. Like Rome's way of saying, someone down there will handle this. I'm sure. The tone often stays contractual. Do this, and you will be paid. Do this, and your altar will not go thirsty. It's devotion with receipts, which feels strangely modern in a quiet way, like subscribing to a service you hope will change your life, except you pay with incense and a small cake instead of money. The petitioner tries to sound respectful and certain. This is difficult when you are asking an invisible power to rearrange another person's desire, which is a bit like asking the sea to hold still. But the words are written anyway, because certainty is sometimes just a costume you put on so you can get through the night dot, and then there's the uneasy part, the line you cross. In Rome, magic wasn't a single clear category. Some charms were normal, some rituals looked like medicine, some things were tolerated as long as they didn't embarrass anyone important. Other things became criminal when a scandal needed an explanation or when fear wanted a target. If someone found a tablet, it could become evidence, and suddenly your secret handwriting is held up in daylight by a person who is paid to disapprove. That's a chilling image. Your private want treated like a public offense dot, so people hid things. They used cramped writing. They used obscure words. They wrote as if they didn't want even their own future selves to fully understand. They kept their houses tidy because a tidy house looks innocent, and innocence has always had a strong relationship with good lighting. And there were remedies too, because anxiety loves a backup plan. Counterspells, knots untied, dolls washed, herbs burned. Small rituals meant to convince breath and mind to choose another road. Because sometimes the real target of a spell is the person casting it. Trying to feel less powerless, most of these tablets, though were never discovered in their own time, they stayed where they were placed, damp and patient, holding their commands like folded breath, which means that after is often just waiting. The petitioner returns to ordinary life and watches for signs, because humans are extremely talented at turning slow changes into evidence. If the target writes, perhaps it worked. If the target lingers in the market a little longer than usual, perhaps it worked. If the target sleeps badly and you happen to hear about it, perhaps it worked. Friends might call it coincidence. The petitioner calls it proof. The gods, if they are involved at all, remain politely silent, which is one of their most consistent traits. Effects are measured in inches, not thunder. A glance held a second longer. A conversation that doesn't end quickly. A forgotten plan. A sudden urge to visit the baths at the same hour you happen to be there, which might be fate, or might just be the ancient world's version of a predictable schedule. And if the petitioner promised offerings, they might pay them oil cakes, a garland that smells briefly sweet before wilting because miracles are expensive and this isn't a miracle. It's a nudge, a tug, a whispered request placed where sunlight doesn't reach. There's something almost comforting in how ordinary it all feels. People still write messages they hope will change someone's mind. They just use screens now and send them too quickly and regret them immediately, which is its own kind of ritual. The waiting afterward is the same. The rereading, the tiny shifts in hope, the soft embarrassment of caring too much, dressed up as strategy. So keep the facts in one jar lead. Names, knots, nails, wells, graves, crossroads, the underworld's reliable address. Keep the feelings in another want, fear, haste, and the quiet wish to be chosen. Breathe in for 4, out for 6, and let the mind loosen its grip. Assume every command risks a price, even if the receipt arrives years later, damp and unreadable. And if you can, change one small thing tomorrow, your schedule, your sentence, your patience before you ask the earth to change someone else for you. The lamp dims. The stylus cools. The ground holds its breath in its patient way, and the request folded, heavy, silent keeps resting where it was placed, as if it could wait forever. You might not expect an empire to feel most real when you're listening to someone argue with a pile of salt. But that is quietly where a lot of history lives. Not in marble speeches. Not in banners. In salt that clumps, in salt that spills, in salt that has to be weighed twice because someone, somewhere, once tried to be clever with a scoop. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let your breathing slow down as if the night has finally stopped asking questions. And if you're still awake when we reach the part where a clerk has to record the exact number of sacks that look identical, you can subscribe if you want. Or don't. The Venetian Salt Office, if it had opinions, would probably file your decision in a drawer and never mention it again. For part 7, we're going to drift into the Venetian Republic's salt bureaucracy, which sounds like a joke until you realize salt was not just a seasoning. It was policy. It was money you could taste. It was an everyday object that governments stared at with the intensity of a cat watching a spoon. Venice, being Venice, did not simply have salt. It administered salt. It made salt into a kind of soft, edible paperwork that had to move across water without dissolving into the sea like a tragic metaphor. Imagine a quiet morning in Venice. Not the postcard Venice, but the administrative Venice, where the most dramatic thing is a stamp hitting wax. Somewhere near the edge of the lagoon, salt pans sit low and bright, shallow rectangles of water that spend their days evaporating slowly, like they're practicing patience. Salt forms in crusts, and workers scrape it up with tools that are basically polite shovels. The work is repetitive, which is perfect because repetition is what makes something feel inevitable. And governments love inevitability. Once salt exists, it becomes a problem. It has to be measured, moved, stored, priced, and ideally kept from being quietly reclassified as missing. Salt is wonderfully suspicious that way. A sack can leak. A sack can be damp. A sack can be temporarily misplaced while we check something. And so Venice built systems committees, offices, regulations that treated salt like a small animal that might escape if you blink. A clerk's day could begin with a list. Not a poetic list. A list that begins with quantities, locations, and names written in ink that dries slowly in humid air. The clerk counts barrels and sacks, and sometimes has to count again, because someone else counted earlier and got a different number, and this is how tiny mysteries are born. There is a particular kind of boredom that comes from being responsible for objects that refuse to be interesting, and salt is very good at that. It looks the same, whether it's legal or illegal. It sparkles with equal enthusiasm on both sides of a regulation the Venetian state often tried to control the salt trade through a mix of monopoly, licensing, and the kind of rules that make a person sigh before they even break them. Salt was important for preserving food, which means it was important for surviving winter, which means it was important for not becoming an angry crowd, which governments tend to prefer. So the state set prices, managed supply, and arranged contracts that made salt feel less like a mineral and more like a negotiated relationship. If you drift a little deeper into this, you start to see the shape of the system. Salt comes in through certain channels, moves through certain warehouses, gets recorded in certain books, and ends up in certain markets where ordinary people buy it without thinking about the chain of signatures behind it. In Venice, that chain mattered. There were officials whose job was essentially to ensure that salt remained properly boring, predictable, available, and taxed in the correct way. If salt became exciting, it was usually because something went wrong, and something always threatens to go wrong in the quiet way. A shipment arrives late because the wind decided to have its own schedule. A barge sits heavy in the water, the sacks swelling slightly from humidity, making every measurement feel like a debate. Someone claims the salt is lower quality, which is a polite way of saying, I would like to pay less. Someone else insists it's fine, which is a polite way of saying, absolutely not. The argument is not loud. It is slow. It is performed with documents, with witnesses, with the weary certainty that paperwork will outlive everyone involved. There were also roots, and roots are where the world gets mischievous. Venice had a talent for turning geography into policy, and the lagoon itself is a kind of watery filing cabinet, full of channels that look similar if you're tired. Salt had to move through this landscape, and any movement creates opportunities, some accidental, some not. Smuggling is, in many cases, just commerce that doesn't want to fill out the form. And salt, being essential and easy to conceal in bulk, attracted that kind of attention. Picture a small boat at dusk, not dramatic, just quiet, moving with the same low urgency as someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. A few sacks, a plausible story, a route that avoids a particular checkpoint because the checkpoint is staffed by someone who recognizes your face and your handwriting. Smuggling can sound thrilling in other contexts, but with salt, it often becomes deeply unromantic, a damp sack, a nervous rower, and the very real possibility of having to explain yourself to a man whose entire personality is rules. Venice answered this with more administration, more inspectors, more records, more small penalties that exist to discourage people without creating a scandal. The state didn't always want drama. It wanted compliance. It wanted the salt to go where it was supposed to go, at the price it was supposed to be, with the tax it was supposed to carry, like a well-behaved citizen made of crystals, asterisk. And then there are the places salt sleeps, which is to say, warehouses. Salt warehouses are wonderfully dull. They smell faintly sharp, like clean stone. They are stacked with sacks that settle into themselves over time, the way the mind settles into routine. Workers move slowly, because moving quickly around heavy sacks is how you injure yourself and become a problem for someone else's pleasure. A warehouse keeper learns to trust weight, texture, and the sound a sack makes when it's set down. It's a sensory world, but not an exciting one, more like the gentle obsession of someone who can tell the difference between two identical-looking objects because they have spent their life being responsible for them. This is where the bureaucracy becomes almost tender in its own strange way. People mark things, they label, they seal, they lock. They create systems because systems are comforting, especially when the thing you're systematizing is essential and irritatingly easy to mishandle. Salt is not gold. It does not inspire worship. It inspires procedures. Now we drift into the legal and moral atmosphere around it, which is another way of saying what happens when someone gets caught or when someone wants to accuse someone else. In Venice, like many states, the law could be precise in a way that feels almost sleepy. It defines what counts as legitimate salt, what counts as questionable salt, and what counts as salt that has been introduced to the market in a manner that makes everyone pretend not to notice until it becomes inconvenient. A fascinating thing about regulations is that they create new vocabulary. Not poetic vocabulary, administrative vocabulary. Words for licenses, duties, exemptions, inspection rights, warehouse categories, and the specific kind of fine that is small enough to be paid and large enough to sting. Somewhere someone wrote a rule about who could sell salt in which districts, at what times, from what containers. The rule exists because someone earlier sold salt in the wrong way and made it everyone's problem. And yes, people complained. People always do. Market sellers might grumble about prices. Fishermen might have opinions about quality because salt is how fish becomes tomorrow's fish instead of yesterday as smell. Households might stretch salt, which is a quiet way of admitting that even essential things have budgets. There's a strange intimacy in that. Government policy showing up in your kitchen, sitting on the edge of a pot, pretending to be just a pinch. Officials also had to deal with the fact that salt is not uniform. Some salt is finer, some is damp, some is mixed with sand or other minerals because the world does not always deliver purity on schedule. So there are arguments about standards, what counts as acceptable, what counts as fraud, what counts as unfortunate but still sellable. These debates are not glamorous, but they are deeply human. People negotiating fairness with tools like scales and sworn statements. If you imagine the scene, it's mostly quiet voices in a room that smells faintly of paper and seawater. A complaint is read, a response is written. Witnesses confirm that yes, the salt was indeed clumpy, and no, it did not sparkle in a way that justified the price. Somewhere, a clerk writes a sentence that will never be quoted in a movie. The aforementioned sacks were found wanting in dryness. That is the sound of history being honest. Eventually, we reach the after effects, the slow consequences that are not dramatic endings, but continuing habits. The salt system keeps working because it has to. The world does not stop needing preservation. People do not stop eating. Governments do not stop wanting predictable revenue. The boring machine turns, and each turn is another day in which someone checks a storehouse and notes that the number has changed in an expected way, which is the greatest luxury of all. Change that does not surprise you. Sometimes the success of the system is measured by how little anyone notices it. If the market has salt, if the price does not provoke anger, if the warehouses remain stocked, the officials have done their jobs. No applause, no parade. Just a city that continues to cook, pickle, cure, and survive. It is like maintaining a household routine. The reward for doing it well is that nothing catches fire. And the strangest thing is how the paperwork outlasts the salt itself. Salt gets eaten, salt dissolves, salt disappears into food and seawater in time. But the records can remain pages listing shipments, quantities, disputes, fines, and approvals. Long after the sacks are gone, the ink still says they were once here. That is quietly the whole point of administration, to create a memory that does not rely on taste. So as we end, not with a conclusion, but with a soft fade, you can hold the simple idea like a small grain between your fingers. Empires aren't only built on grand battles. Sometimes they're built on the steady control of things so ordinary you forget they have power. Salt, weight, roads, ledgers, a clerk's careful handwriting. a warehouse that smells like stone, a law that tries to make a mineral behave. Breathe in for 4, out for 6, and let the mind loosen around the edges. If you keep one jar for facts, sacks, scales, inspectors, contracts, channels, warehouses, and another jar for the gentle absurdity of it all, how a pinch of seasoning can become a state project, then you can let both jars sit quietly on the shelf. The lagoon keeps moving, the salt pans keep shining in the sun, the ink dries, the sacks settle, and somewhere in the soft distance the city continues, preserved not just by salt, but by the calm, stubborn boredom of keeping it accounted for. You might not expect the Roman world to take desire of all things and file it into something you can fold, pierce, and bury like a forgotten receipt. But that is exactly what happens when a feeling becomes a little too loud in your chest and someone decides it needs to be handled with stationery. If your room is quiet, let it stay that way. Let the quiet do the heavy lifting. Imagine that thin sheet of lead cooling in your palm. Not dramatic, just oddly cold, like a coin that has been waiting all day to be noticed. A stylus rests against it and makes that soft, stubborn scratch that metal makes when it's forced to become language. And somewhere in the distance, a small oil lamp keeps its flame steady, as if it has no opinion about what you're writing. Whisper if you feel like it. Where and what time are you listening from? Not because it matters to the underworld exactly, but because it gives the night something gentle to hold. And if you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe. Or don't. The Romans would understand either way. They were very good at not looking directly at their own habits, which is a skill that pairs nicely with sleep. The first part of this soft, slow process is almost boring in its practicality. Someone has to get the lead, not golden parchment, not scented papyrus, lead. The material choice alone is quietly funny, because it says, without saying it, this is not a nice thought. A thin piece is cut down to palm size, sometimes small enough to hide under a fold of cloth, sometimes large enough to feel like a miniature tablet that wants to be important. It's trimmed with simple tools. It's handled carefully because lead bends easily, and what you want in a spell is control over the object, control over the words, control over the messy, uncooperative thing called someone else. Then comes the writing, which is not the elegant kind of writing you imagine in marble libraries. It's cramped. It's urgent in the smallest possible way. Names appear first, because names are how you point at the world. Sometimes the name is written straight, sometimes backward, sometimes doubled, tangled, repeated, as if the writer thinks repetition makes the universe take notes. It is the ancient equivalent of sending the same message twice and then staring at your phone like it is a sacred object. The stylus scratches the lead and leaves grooves you can feel if you run a fingertip over them, which you probably shouldn't do for long because, again, lead is not a friendly material, and Rome was not big on health warnings. People add details like they're building a tiny cage out of letters, a father's name, a mother's name, a hometown, a job. Anything that reduces a person into identifiers that won't wiggle away. Sometimes it's just one name, plain and heavy, as if the writer is too tired for creativity. Sometimes it's a list of body parts, eyes, tongue, belly, sleep, because the spell wants to manage the person in sections, like a careful inventory. It's strange and also deeply recognizable, because humans have always been tempted to solve complicated feelings by breaking them into manageable categories. And then, in the fold, there's often something extra, something almost domestic, a hair, a thread, a scrap of fabric, a bit of wax. Not because the universe requires craft supplies, but because the human mind loves a physical anchor. It's comforting, in a way, to press a fragment of the real world into the spell, like you're making sure the request has the correct postage. The tablet becomes a little packet of wanting, and wanting is always trying to pretend it is reasonable. The words themselves can be oddly mechanical. Latin, Greek, and sometimes mixtures that feel like someone rummaging through a drawer of languages and pulling out whatever seems effective. There are voces magicae, strings of syllables that don't translate cleanly because they aren't meant to. They're meant to sound like authority. They're meant to sound like something older than the person writing them. They're meant to feel official, like a stamp. It's funny how quickly people reach for nonsense when they want power. Not loud nonsense. Quiet nonsense, written carefully, as if the shape of the letters matters more than their meaning. And the verbs tend to be blunt. Bind, draw, burn, soften, return, come, stay, forget, remember. The adverbs are impatient in small ways, soon, quickly, immediately, like the writer is negotiating with time itself. There's a lot of certainty on these tablets, which is touching, because certainty is often just fear wearing a tidy robe. But the overall tone is not theatrical, it's contractual. This in exchange for that. These offerings later if you do the thing now. Rome loved contracts, and even desire sometimes had to pass through that mental doorway. Once the tablet is written, it stops being a writing problem and becomes a delivery problem. You can't just leave it on the table next to the bread and olives. It needs to go somewhere that feels close to the forces you're asking. That usually means down, not metaphorically down, physically down, into the earth, into water, into places where the normal rules feel thinner. Sometimes people fold the lead like a letter they don't want anyone to read. Sometimes they roll it tight like a small scroll because it's easier to hide that way. And then the nails come out. Not fancy nails. Ordinary ones, the kind that hold wood together, suddenly promoted to a spiritual purpose. A nail through a tablet is a very Roman gesture. Practical violence as symbolism, neat and direct. You're fixing the message in place. You're pinning the request to reality so it can't drift away. If you were being modern, you might call it sending with delivery confirmation, but with more rust. And then there are the dolls, which sound dramatic, but often aren't. Small figures made of clay or wax, pierced at joints, bound with thread, sometimes wrapped in little knots. Knots are another favorite detail, because knots feel like control you can hold in your hand. Tie it 3 times, 7 times, 9 times numbers that sound significant even if you can't explain why. The knot tightens, the intention tightens. The mind feels briefly like it has done something measurable. Rome was full of measurements, roads, taxes, ranks, weights. Why not measure desire in knots? Some people add a small mirror face down beside the bundle. The idea is that the target won't see another path, won't look away, won't notice alternatives. It's a sleepy kind of manipulation, the kind that thinks the world is a hallway and you can gently lock certain doors. It's also, in a quiet way, sad, because it treats another person's mind like a room you can rearrange if you have the right tools, but we won't linger on sadness. We'll just let it sit there like a heavy object on a shelf. Now the question becomes, where do you put it? Where do these little lead wishes go to sleep? And the answers are wonderfully specific, which is exactly the kind of detail that makes the brain drift. Graves, especially the graves of people who died young or violently, because those spirits were thought to be restless and therefore more available for errands. Wells, because wells are deep and feel like a throat in the earth. Bathhouses, because bathhouses collect secrets the way cloth collects lint. Crossroads shrines, because crossroads are places where choices happen and choices make the air feel thin. Sometimes tablets end up in stadiums or theaters, tucked under seats or stones, which is almost comical. Imagine going to watch a performance and unknowingly sitting above someone's carefully folded desperation. The crowd cheers. The actor gestures. The tablet stays quiet, doing its little administrative job beneath the public life of the city. Rome was very good at having 2 worlds at once, the loud world of civic display and the quiet world of private bargaining with invisible powers. A coin might be included, not as a bribe exactly, but as a small courtesy. payment for the messenger below, or a simple habit. You don't ask for a service without leaving something behind. The ground is patted flat afterward. The person walks away without changing pace because changing pace might feel suspicious, and also because many human rituals require you to pretend you're not doing anything special. That's the real magic sometimes, the ability to act normal while carrying something strange. When the tablet is buried, it begins its second life in the company of gods, spirits, and legal lines that people only notice when they cross them. Because the Romans didn't live in a world where magic was neatly separated from religion or law. It was more like a messy drawer. Prayers, curses, charms, and official rituals all bumped into each other, and sometimes they borrowed each other's wording. The beings called on are often chthonic underworld adjacent, the ones who dwell below or near the edges. Hecate with her crossroads and keys, Persephone with her seasonal seriousness, Pluto who is less devil and more administrator of the dead. Sometimes demonic spirits appear too, the restless middle management of the supernatural, imagined as available, a little bored, and therefore willing to take on tasks. And ancestors get invoked as witnesses, which is such a Roman idea. Even the dead should be properly documented. There's a dry practicality in the way the requests are framed. Help me, and I will repay. Do this, and my offering will come. Don't do this, and I will. Usually nothing, because threatening the underworld is not a great long-term plan. The tone is often less romantic than procedural. It's not a poem. It's a memo with feelings attached. And because Rome is always Rome, there's also the awareness that this might be illegal, or at least socially risky, depending on the place and time. Magic wasn't consistently prosecuted as one thing. It became a problem when someone decided it was a problem, which is also very Roman. A practice can be tolerated for years until it becomes politically useful to condemn it. So you get a world where people do these things quietly, while also knowing there are moments when the wrong neighbor, the wrong rumor, or the wrong public scandal can turn a folded piece of lead into evidence. Imagine a person being fined not for having feelings, but for having feelings in a way that produced an object. An object you can hold up. An object you can point to and say, look, this person attempted to negotiate with the dark. It's always easier to prosecute an artifact than an emotion. The priests become experts. The magistrates become suddenly interested in the subtleties of knots. Informers appear, because informers always appear when there is profit in noticing what others would prefer to hide. There are remedies too, which are sometimes just counter-rituals and sometimes just good housekeeping. Wash the doll. Untie the knots. Burn herbs that smell sharp enough to convince the air itself to choose a different direction. Some people wear amulets. Some ask for help from professionals, people who, in any other context, would just be called specialists. The underworld gets a lot of mail, and naturally there are people who claim they know the postal system. And yet, despite all this caution, the tablets kept being made, which tells you something gentle and constant about humans. We keep inventing small systems to cope with wanting things we can't control. We build rituals because rituals feel like handles, even if the handle isn't attached to anything. Eventually, in this slow, sleepy arc that isn't really an arc, we arrive at the part everyone secretly checks for. Even if they pretend they don't, what happens after? Not fireworks, not thunder. The results, when described, are often subtle, almost disappointingly ordinary. The target smiles at you, the target dreams of you. The target feels uneasy and can't explain why. The target wanders past your door. The target forgets an old plan. The target sleeps badly. Effects measured in inches, not in storms. Friends might call it coincidence. And they might be right. The petitioner calls it proof. The god, if the god is paying attention, calls it a completed transaction. This is the beauty of vague outcomes. They're flexible. A small change can be interpreted as success. A lack of change can be blamed on incorrect wording, insufficient offerings, or a rival's counterspell. There's always a reason, which is wonderfully comforting to the mind that doesn't want randomness. Payments, if they happen, are small and domestic oil, cakes, garlands. Nothing too dramatic. Miracles are expensive, and most people were not shopping at the miracle store with a large budget. So they offer what they can, and they hope the underworld has modest tastes. The tablet remains below, working by habit, long after anyone remembers exactly what they asked for. That's another gentle irony. The object lasts, the feeling changes, and the request sits in the dark like an outdated instruction. And it's possible, too, that nothing happens, or that what happens is simply the passage of time, dressed up as meaning. But we won't insist on that. This is bedtime history, not a courtroom. We can let the ambiguity be part of the softness. Rome was full of ambiguity. Their gods had complicated moods. Their laws had loopholes. Their people had long days and short nights and ordinary hearts that wanted what they wanted. So we end the way these episodes like to end, with something like an oath, but not a loud one. Keep facts in one jar, lead, nails, knots, graves, wells, names, scratched into metal contracts with the dark, and keep the gentle absurdity in another. How the smallest human longing can produce an object that survives centuries in the soil like a stubborn whisper. Assume every command risks a price, even if the receipt arrives years late and in a language you don't fully recognize. Change one small thing tomorrow, your schedule, your sentence, your patience, before you ask the earth to change someone else. That's not a moral lesson, exactly. It's just a quiet, practical suggestion, like wiping the table before you write on it again. The lamp dims, the stylus cools, the lid goes still. The ground holds its breath without trying too hard. And desire, which never really stays where you put it, learns to walk a little more slowly, as if it finally understands that the night prefers softer footsteps.